There's really no way in which we can deter the North Koreans from proceeding with these tests. And so there are ways that we could rebuild our policy really from the ground up, pursuing what I think should be a focus on risk reduction, because denuclearization, I think, has hampered our ability to think about risk reduction in a realistic way.
That's the voice of Ankit Panda, Stanton Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plasters Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts Tom Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, great to see you. And since this is our first episode of 2023, Happy New Year. How were your holidays?
Hi, Tom. Happy New Year to you and to everyone listening. I had a great holiday break, and I had a great start to 2023, and I hope that you have as well, Tom, and again to our listeners. So tell me, Tom, how were your holidays? How's your New Year been so far?
It's been great, thanks. Over the holidays, had some nice time with family in Florida, had some downtime back here in DC. I flew on Southwest Airlines and did not get stranded, so it's all good.
Oh, thank goodness. I would hate to know that you were in that whole debacle. I hate that anyone was. Hopefully everyone got to where they were going okay with everything that they own. But Tom, for the first time this year, let me ask, what do you have for us on the nuclear front?
Well, thanks, Lauren. On Ukraine, as the new year starts, both sides are digging in for a long slog, unfortunately. In a New Year's speech, President Zelensky pledged to retake all of Ukraine by the end of the year. And to aid this effort, the United States, Germany, and France have agreed for the first time to send light tanks to Ukraine, such as the Bradley fighting vehicle. At the same time, President Putin used his New Year's speeches to prepare Russians for a long battle. At least 100,000 newly mobilized Russian soldiers are digging into fortified defensive positions in eastern Ukraine. So it's a good bet that the war in Ukraine will be with us for at least the duration of this year. U.S. senators are raising concern about the AUKUS nuclear submarine plan. In a letter to President Biden, Senators Jack Reed and Jim Inhofe expressed concerns that the United States could not build enough nuclear attack submarines to meet its own needs, let alone provide any to Australia. Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, assured reporters over the weekend that the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia remain committed to the AUKUS Defense Pact. Here in Washington, Congressman Kevin McCarthy was elected U.S. House Speaker after 15 rounds of voting and multiple days of negotiations, the longest speaker contest in 164 years. McCarthy's election was blocked on 14 ballots by Republican right-wing holdouts, turning a usually routine process into a days-long drama that suggests ongoing turmoil in the narrowly divided Congress. There are several important tasks for Congress to fulfill, including passing a dozen spending bills to keep the government fully funded and raising the borrowing limit for the Treasury Department. But McCarthy's concessions, which give right-wing Republicans more power, will also make it harder to pass new legislation. And finally, a Russian hacking team known as Cold River targeted 3 nuclear research laboratories in the United States this past summer, according to a report by Reuters. The attack targeted Brookhaven, Argonne, and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories between August and September. At the same time, President Putin was threatening to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Reuters was unable to determine why the labs were targeted or if the intrusions were successful, and the labs have not commented on the report. And Lauren, what do we have lined up for early warning?
This week on Early Warning, Angela Kellett sits down with John Pope, the Chief Audience Officer at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They discuss the historical significance of the Doomsday Clock as we prepare for this year's clock setting on January 24th. We'll continue to keep you updated on this story, so stay tuned.
And then I talked with Ankit Panda at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We discussed North Korea's nuclear plans for 2023, how South Korea has responded to the North's provocations, and whether the United States should accept the North as a nuclear state. It's a great discussion covering a wide range of topics, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Each year, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Science and Security Board selects how close to midnight the Doomsday Clock is based on existential threats, such as nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies. The Doomsday Clock is a symbol of the dangers posed by these existential threats. The Science and Security Board will announce how close the clock is to midnight on January 24th at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. In January 2022, the Science and Security Board set the Doomsday Clock at 100 seconds to midnight. The third straight year has remained at 100 seconds. In an increasingly tense international security landscape, they called Ukraine a potential flashpoint. So how will the war in Ukraine affect the Doomsday Clock this year? To learn more about the Doomsday Clock, today we are joined by John Pope, the Chief Audience Officer at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, hi Angela. Thanks for having me on. Really excited to talk with you all.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to you. So can you explain a bit about the significance and history of the Doomsday Clock for our listeners?
Yeah, it's, I think, actually a really interesting story. And I'll give you a kind of a summary version here. But if you're really into it, we have this book called The Doomsday Clock at 75, where you can dive into a lot more of the history and the impact. And honestly, the book's also just a great coffee table book because it has all these gorgeous illustrations of art inspired by the clock. But anyway, I'm not here to promote that. Let me talk about the history, and I'll start at the beginning. So the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists was founded in December of 1945 by folks who had been working on the Manhattan Project. And after the bombs use in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Trinity test in New Mexico, had started grappling with what they had created, the danger it could cause, and how do we bring the public into conversations about how we reduce the risk from nuclear weapons. And one of the ways they wanted to do that was to have a newsletter to kind of start spreading information around and engaging people in the topic. And that became the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And by 1947, they wanted to make it more formal and a little more in-depth, so they created a magazine. And they needed a cover for the very first issue of the magazine. And being very smart scientists, they realized they also weren't very good artists. So they started reaching out to try to find an artist. And luckily, one of them happened to be married to this landscape artist, Marta Langsdorff. And she was tasked with come up with a really powerful cover. The only trick is you can only use white, black, and one other color. So she had a little bit of limitations, but I think she did a really amazing job. And I think the first thing you have to note with what she did with coming up with the clock and putting that on the cover is that she didn't do something nuclear. It wasn't a mushroom cloud. It wasn't a nucleus or an atom or anything. But she had been, in this community, listening to these conversations and taking part of them, and realized that folks were already starting to talk about things beyond nuclear, talking about the fact that we were entering an era where humanity had the chance to destroy itself because of its innovations in science. And this is a kind of radical thing in the middle of the 20th century where science is kind of glorified and we're looking for all the ways we can improve our life, to acknowledge that there's a double-edged sword sometimes with certain innovations. So even at that very beginning point, the Bulletin was thinking about nuclear risk, but also about all the other things that could come down the line. And that ended up being climate change and biosecurity and artificial intelligence and all these other disruptive technologies. So she reflected that by trying to capture the emotion rather than the issue area. And she used this metaphor that we see in like spy movies and stuff all the time, right? This ticking clock, it's like James Bond has to defuse the bomb before it reaches zero. I think she did it a little more elegantly with this kind of beautiful, simple, abstract, even quarter clock face design with a minute hand moving towards midnight that conveys, these issues are urgent. It's not trying to inspire fear necessarily, but that we have limited time to figure out how to make things more stable. That's where we're at 1947. And then 1949, the Soviets test their first nuclear weapon. And we're in a bona fide arms race. And the Bulletin and the scientists involved are writing a lot and speaking to the public a lot to try to illustrate how this is dangerous and what we can do about it. And they also have to think what they're going to do with the magazine. Obviously, they have articles, but they also have this brilliant idea to move the minute hand on the clock forward. And they move it to 3 minutes to midnight. And that begins this tradition of having the clock move forward and backward to reflect the state of risk in the world. That risk isn't permanent, but that by our actions, we can make things more or less risky. And that's what happened over the next, 75 years of the Bulletin having the clock. We responded. In the 90s, we went down to 17 minutes from midnight. In the height of the Cold War, we were at 2 minutes to midnight. Recently, we moved to 100 seconds to midnight, the closest we've ever been because of how unstable things are and the kind of interlocking complex challenges that we're facing from nuclear weapons, from climate change, from disruptive tech. So we have the design and we have the movement of the clock. And the third element comes in a little more wishy-washy, I guess. It's the name, this Doomsday Clock. It didn't actually come from the Bulletin originally. It was kind of circulating in the public and in news articles, and the Bulletin eventually adopted it in the 70s because that's how it was being talked about. But the important thing there is that this little symbol is being talked about, right? It has become this powerful metaphor for the times we're in and for the idea that there are these complex risks that are being created by us. It's showing up in movies, in magazines, in comic books, and in music even. And it does so today, right? Think about Madam Secretary had an episode about the Doomsday Clock, or Jimmy Kimmel talking about it on his show. So it's become this really powerful symbol that kind of boils things down to one short soundbite that anyone, regardless of whether they are an atomic scientist or they're artist like Martel, can talk about what's happening real quickly. We are 100 seconds to midnight. So that's, I think, the first important part of the significance. We have a shared symbol that's a shorthand to talk about these risks and can start a conversation about the different elements that are causing risk and the ways we can, potentially push the clock back, the solutions we have. Like I said, the clock's moved from down all the way to 17 minutes from midnight in the 90s. There's hope, right? The clock doesn't just tick forward, it moves backwards. And then I think the second important significance of the clock is a little more subtle and doesn't get talked about as much, but it's the story of its creation. It's a collaborative effort that came over multiple years, right, from both the outside and inside of the organization. And it's also originally starting with someone who's not Einstein or Oppenheimer, right? Those big famous scientists were involved in the Bulletin from the beginning, but you also have a woman who's an artist in the 40s inserting herself into this conversation where often women weren't being in the room and weren't necessarily getting to push on these policy issues. And her contribution of the design has carried forward for 75 plus years now and has helped shape the public consciousness and public debate around these issues for that entire time. And to me, that's a sign that really any of us can contribute to solving these issues and that we can all kind of work in our community and join organizations and educate ourselves and our family and our friends and ultimately help make the world safer, ultimately help turn back the clock. And I think a great starting point to that is the clock announcement. So I hope we'll have everyone be able to join us and engage in that conversation on the 24th.
So why did the Doomsday Clock remain at 100 seconds to midnight last year? And what factors may affect the clock's time this year?
I think really early on, the Bulletin decided that we couldn't react to everything, that we wanted the clock to be a summary of the state of risk at a kind of underlying level rather than something that was like daily updated, right? So we've kind of moved to a habit of updating about every year or so. And sometimes the update is that it stays the same. It's been at 100 seconds to midnight now for a couple years. And that's because the kind of underlying structures are unstable. The message that the Science and Security Board that sets the clock, that they've been trying to send, is that we have an unstable system. We're the closest we've ever been to midnight. We have the potential for disastrous things to happen, like the outbreak of conflict in Eastern Europe. In some ways, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a manifestation of what 100 seconds to midnight looks like. It's the demonstration of, an inherently unstable system that we have to find ways to make more stable and to reduce the risk because we have these threatening technologies like nuclear weapons. So in terms of, as we're thinking about what will set the clock to this year, first and foremost, the invasion of Ukraine will be a huge part of the conversation for the impact it's had on Ukrainians and on the rest of Europe, but also the impact that's being felt around the world and these ripple effects and the food markets and the energy markets and the potential other threats that it exposes of geopolitical instability and war. So that's going to be a huge part of the discussion. But the clock itself covers nuclear risks, climate change, and disruptive technologies. And in each of those categories, there's been developments over the past year, whether it's changing situations around the Iran deal or testing developments in North Korea, or the various elements we've seen around climate change for good and for ill, like the COP summit or the droughts and floods we've seen. There's a lot going on these topics. So all of them get brought into conversation and boiled down to one metaphor, which is hence the power and the mystique of the Doomsday Clock.
So how can listeners stay updated on the Doomsday Clock announcement on January 24th?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you. So first, people should go to thebulletin.org. That's our website. We're putting out articles all the time. And as much as the Doomsday Clock kind of boils down the complexity, the rest of the year, we're often exposing the nuance and trying to make it more approachable to people. So we're a space where experts and activists can kind of unpack what these issues are and the solutions. So if you go to thebulletin.org, you'll see links to the Doomsday Clock where you can read all of the history and the current clock time and FAQs. They also see articles about all of the issues that are covered in the clock. And after you go there, if you want to stay updated, the easiest thing to do is to sign up for our newsletter. You can get emailed to your inbox twice a week that summarize articles, and we'll give you updates on the Doomsday Clock. You'll also be able to follow us on social media. And ultimately, the key takeaway for this week and the rest of this month is on January 24th at 10 a.m. Eastern. We would love for you to tune into our website to watch the clock announcement and join us in the conversation.
Thank you so much for joining me today, John. We'll definitely be keeping up to date on the Doomsday Clock.
Great. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
For nuclear-armed North Korea, 2022 was off the charts. It launched almost 90 missiles, far more than any other year, and its leader, Kim Jong Un, declared that the North had become a nuclear weapon state and that its weapons were here to stay. For 2023, Mr. Kim has declared that he plans to exponentially increase the production of nuclear weapons, and Korea watchers are expecting a seventh nuclear test soon. Given the dangers, South Korea and the United States recently announced they are engaging in joint planning to counter North Korea's increasing nuclear activities. Yet meanwhile, there are no signs of diplomatic talks to slow down North Korea's program. To help us understand this developing situation, today we're joined by Ankit Panda. He is the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he's the author of the recent book, Kim Jong Un and the Bomb: Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. Ankit, great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Good to join you.
So let's start with the basics. Give us your assessment of North Korea's nuclear arsenal as it stands and what you expect to see in the coming year in terms of their weapons development.
Yeah, happy to. So the place to begin is actually a little more than 5 years ago in late 2017. 2017 was a pretty incredible year for the North Koreans. That was the first time in history that they demonstrated an intercontinental range strike capability. Among all nuclear states, North Korea has a unique deterrence challenge. They are at the same time trying to develop capabilities to deter a territorially contiguous, qualitatively superior alliance in the form of the US-ROK alliance. But at the same time, they have a superpower adversary halfway across the globe that they also need to hold at risk with ICBMs. And so they accomplished that benchmark in 2017. Since then, for the last 5 years, really what we've seen out of North Korea is a process of what I would call modernization and maturation. They are improving their capabilities, they're pursuing greater survivability, greater responsiveness, really all of the stuff that basically we've seen every other nuclear state do after they cross what are seen as the minimal thresholds for deterrence to obtain. So the North Koreans have gone exactly down that path. And January 2021, just a few days actually before President Biden was inaugurated here in the United States, the North Koreans held a party congress, which is the apex political event in their system, where they laid out the next 5 years of political objectives and military goals. And Kim Jong Un took that opportunity to outline a pretty wide-ranging wish list of modernization items that he wanted to see built. This included things like multiple reentry vehicles for ICBMs, new satellites, tactical nuclear weapons, which in my opinion is probably the most negative development for U.S. and allied security in the last few years, and so on and so forth. Hypersonic glide vehicles, long-range cruise missiles. And so the North Koreans have been going about this. Their testing campaign picked up in late 2021, and as you just so nicely laid out, Tom, 2022 was really a remarkable year. They carried out more missile launches, and not all of these launches were tests, by the way. We're in a period now where the word test is no longer appropriate to describe most North Korean missile launches. They are conducting large-scale exercises, and they're doing all of this with the goal that they've always had in mind, which is pursuing an increasingly more credible and robust nuclear deterrent to hold what they see as the United States and South Korea's plans to potentially invade their territory at bay.
Now, it seems like we've been hearing rumors and expecting a North Korean test for months. This would be their 7th. In your view, why hasn't this happened yet? And if they did one, what would they be seeking to get out of it?
Sure. So I think the second part of that question is going to be a lot easier for me to answer than the first, because the reality is we simply don't know why this test hasn't happened yet. The Punggye-ri nuclear test site, the only known nuclear test site in North Korea with a few portals, was restored last year in the spring after a Politburo decision that the North Koreans took in January in response to a package of sanctions, actually, by the United States. They held that Politburo meeting, and at that meeting, Kim Jong Un said that he was going to revisit all of the unilateral gestures that he had offered up during the 2018-2019 period of diplomacy. One of those gestures was shutting down their nuclear test site. They did that without any kind of formal external verification. They invited a few journalists to observe basically explosives going off at the tunnel entrances to where these devices would be placed when they were detonated. And so we just don't know why they haven't actually moved ahead with the test. The site has been, in the opinion of U.S. intelligence community and South Korean intelligence, ready since really, I think, March or April 2022. I can offer up a few reasons that analysts have speculated for this, simply that, the North Koreans are waiting for a politically opportune moment. Sensitivities in China have actually had an effect in pushing North Korea to withhold from testing. North Korea last year acknowledged the arrival of COVID-19 within their borders for the first time and after 2 years, and they've been receiving aid and assistance from China in coping with that. And as a quid pro quo, they might be holding off on the nuclear test because despite being a friendly country to North Korea, China hasn't always seen nuclear tests as a positive development. Quite the contrary, they've condemned these tests in the past and have supported new sanctions resolutions at the Security Council to condemn North Korea, although that is no longer a safe assumption given the changing geopolitics in Northeast Asia. Both Russia and China have publicly made comments that suggest that they would not be willing to support a new sanctions resolution should North Korea conduct a nuclear test. And that's actually a big deal because that would be the first test outside of a member of the P5 to go without a response from the UNSC. Right, India and Pakistan both got a resolution in 1998, and each North Korean test since, all 6, have been followed up by resolutions. So the second part of your question on why they would test is, I think, important. So as I said in my first answer, tactical nuclear weapons are on Kim Jong Un's wish list. And they are looking to, by all appearances, put nuclear weapons on relatively small diameter missile systems. So they have 2 warhead designs that we know of, that we think we know of. They might have more. One of these is a traditional fission implosion design, probably around 1 meter or so in diameter. That's small enough to fit on basically most of their short-range ballistic missiles, and then they have a larger thermonuclear warhead for ICBMs, where space really isn't a concern. Tactical nuclear weapons, though, require, in this case, North Korea to potentially test, to develop, and validate new types of warhead designs. So they'll be looking to further shrink the diameter. It looks like they're trying to at least get below 600 millimeters in diameter to put these new warheads on shorter-range ballistic missiles and potentially cruise missiles. And with cruise missiles, things like the center of gravity of a cruise missile matters quite a bit, so they'll actually be looking to also minimize mass. I'm not going to get too much into the specific designs I think they might test, because that's totally speculative, but they obviously have a long history of nuclear testing to look to in the United States and elsewhere around the world, with a variety of nuclear weapons designs that they could pursue. They're also fissile material constrained still, right? So their constraints, of course, are growing less acute over time as they continue to produce fissile material without constraint. But North Korea is sitting on a lot more highly enriched uranium than they are plutonium, so that might give us a hint about where they might be looking to optimize, given the stockpiles of fissile material that they do have. But when they do test, it is going to be for technical reasons. They're not going to do this just to poke Biden in the eye or make a political point. This is all in the service of making their deterrent more credible. And tactical nuclear weapons, while a new capability, in my opinion, flesh out the nuclear strategy that North Korea has basically maintained as a constant for at least a decade and potentially longer.
So, as we know, South Korea is a non-nuclear state under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. Some are now saying that's not enough and are calling for the redeployment of U.S. nuclear weapons to the South. How, in your view, is the new Yoon government in the South dealing with these new tensions with the North?
Sure. So I think we've seen a return to a familiar dynamic on the peninsula, which is when you have a conservative South Korean administration, conservatives generally tend to take a much harder stance towards the North. You tend to see tensions spike between the two Koreas. You tend to see a secession of diplomacy and talks and more sort of shows of force. And that's exactly what's happened since Yoon's inauguration back in May. On the nuclear dynamics in South Korea, look, on some level, I'm sympathetic to why South Koreans, the public, and parts of the South Korean national security elite are looking to nuclear options, right? Their security environment has declined. I think that's undeniable. Not just North Korea, but also I think the shifting geopolitics again in Northeast Asia, a greater concern about China. And so in that environment, on some level, I think it makes sense that a country like South Korea would be thinking about potentially new steps to improve its security. There's also, of course, the 2017 to 2021 experience they had in the alliance context, where the Trump administration didn't treat them very well, shaking them down for $5 billion to continue supporting South Korea's defense, for instance. So all of this, I think, has led to a search for options. My view, and I've expressed this over multiple trips I've made to Seoul since last year, after I resumed traveling since the pandemic, which is that, nuclear weapons are not the only tools to deter the use of other nuclear weapons. I think that much is apparent. It has been apparent on the Korean Peninsula. But there is a search for a solution to South Korea's North Korea problem. And this is a problem that's getting worse. There are concerns, of course, that what scholars call the stability-instability paradox will manifest on the Korean Peninsula. For listeners, that's basically when you have a relatively high level of strategic stability at the nuclear level, which then gives confidence to competitors that they can engage in conventional provocations or other types of behavior that might be deeply distasteful or risky. India and Pakistan are sort of the classic example in this case, where both countries acquired nuclear weapons, but that didn't really solve India's Pakistan problem insofar as subconventional terrorism is concerned, for instance. So South Korea, I think, has similar concerns. And by the way, I also bring up the South Asian example to sort of remind South Koreans why maybe nuclear weapons aren't going to solve their North Korea problem, because the kinds of things that North Korea does that really put off the South Koreans are problems that cannot be deterred, in my opinion, through South Korea acquiring nuclear weapons. But there is a search for solutions. And to answer your question about what Yoon has actually done in practice, he's a former prosecutor, he's an attorney, he's been briefed on the NPT after he made certain comments on the campaign trail, implying that South Korea would look to redeploy nuclear weapons and potentially even acquire nuclear weapons of its own. And as president, he has been careful about not crossing that red line and indicating that South Korea would pursue a nuclear capability. That said, people in his administration are very favorable towards the idea. There is a huge swell of public opinion support in the country. I still think there's many reasons South Korea will not proliferate practically. The focus that Yoon has focused on is basically proportionality towards the North. So anything the North Koreans do, the South Koreans will do back in return. And this has fed into, in my opinion, spiral dynamics over the last 4 or 5 months, really since September 2022 and all the way through the winter into now, right? We ended the year just a few days before New Year's with a really incredible drone incursion by North Korea into South Korean airspace that grounded air traffic at Incheon International Airport and Gimpo Airport in Seoul. That's quite serious. And the South Koreans responded by then crossing the MDL with their own drones, right? So there's this focus on proportionality. What worries me is that there's a big focus on very threatening rhetoric towards the North, including threatening the leadership of North Korea. I don't know about you, Tom, but I generally think it's a good idea not to threaten the leadership of a nuclear-armed state, since that is deeply destabilizing. The South Koreans don't seem to believe that threats of punishment are integral to deterring nuclear use by North Korea. But this is where things stand. And unfortunately, the North Koreans show no sign of letting up on the limited provocations that they've been carrying out to irk South Korea. So that's where we stand heading into this new year.
Well, couldn't agree with you more on the lack of advisability of targeting nuclear armed leaders. Shifting to sort of the U.S. diplomacy front, as we know, U.S. diplomacy with North Korea collapsed in 2019 after the Trump administration's high-profile effort and multiple summits came to naught. What, if anything, in your view, is the Biden administration planning to do?
So North Korea, I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, is not at the top of the agenda in Washington, D.C., right? There is a war in Europe. The new national security strategy is clear that the United States is dealing with Russia as a short-term challenge while planning for long-term strategic competition with China. North Korea in this picture, and I think the NSS is really sort of demonstrative of this, the Biden administration categorizes North Korea as a problem alongside Iran and violent extremist organizations in the NSS. Now, that strikes me as a very kind of mid-2000s way of looking at the North Korea problem. Everything we've been talking about, tactical nuclear weapons, new types of capabilities, MIRVs on ICBMs, I think really suggests that the nature of this problem has changed. My opinion on this is that North Korea is no longer a non-proliferation problem for the United States, but a problem of deterrence and disarmament. The Biden administration carried out a policy review on looking at North Korea in 2021 after they entered office, and the results of that review, at least the ways in which they were publicly presented, sounded pretty good. The administration was talking about pursuing a calibrated and practical approach to reduce the threat. Reducing the threat is a pretty interesting turn of phrase because it implies the U.S. might have interests on the Korean Peninsula short of total denuclearization, which I think is just generally seen now as an intractable objective in the short term. So reducing the risk, reducing the threat, moving towards something like arms control, all of that has been counseled by many of us who work on these issues outside of government. The administration has shown very little interest in this. Of course, it takes two to tango, and the North Koreans have also shown very little interest in sitting down and talking to the United States. They are all in on their modernization agenda. Kim Jong Un last September, on the occasion of North Korea's founding anniversary, gave a speech in which he said, he's going to keep his nuclear weapons forever. The United States can sanction us for 1,000 years. We're ready to live with this. And I keep going back to the geopolitical shifts in Northeast Asia, but Kim has also, I think, indicated that Russia and China are becoming much better partners for North Korea than they probably ever have been for North Korea during Kim Jong Un's 10 plus years in power now. So for North Korea, it's actually a workable geopolitical situation right now. They don't need to necessarily talk to the United States to receive sanctions relief, which is what they cared about really going into the summit in Hanoi in 2019, for instance. So all of this said, the Biden administration's main focus right now is on shoring up extended deterrence, reassuring allies, and pursuing trilateralism in Northeast Asia between Japan and South Korea, using North Korea partly as a driver of that cooperation. And all of those objectives, I think, are worthwhile, but they don't address what I think is a core national interest for the United States, which is looking at this part of the world and looking at a country like North Korea that has a low threshold for nuclear use, credible nuclear capabilities to hold at risk, forward-deployed troops that we have on the Korean Peninsula and in Japan, our allies, of course, and, of course, the U.S. homeland. And not a single centrifuge has stopped spinning in North Korea. Not a single warhead has been dismantled. We have no tools to deal with North Korea's missile testing. There's really no way in which we can deter the North Koreans from proceeding with these tests. And so there are ways that we could rebuild our policy really from the ground up, pursuing what I think should be a focus on risk reduction, because denuclearization, I think, has hampered our ability to think about risk reduction in a realistic way. When you're primarily focused as a matter of policy with the legitimacy of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. And it is an illegitimate arsenal. They are the only country to have ever left the NPT, built nuclear weapons, and basically gotten away with it, so I recognize that. But the fact of the matter is that these weapons do exist. They do have a capability to inflict terrible harm and damage, and I think our policy should acknowledge that and take as its first principle the prevention of nuclear war in Northeast Asia and reducing the scope of potential nuclear use by North Korea. As North Korea grows more confident in its capabilities, as this modernization that's ongoing continues, as they build more warheads, on some level we might be heading into a more stabilizing relationship in the sense that all else being equal, North Korea will feel more confident in the survivability of its nuclear forces than they might have perhaps in 2017 when we saw a crisis bubble between the two countries. But that doesn't leave me reassured. I do want measures of negotiated restraint between the two countries. I think we need to shape Kim Jong Un's choices about his nuclear arsenal.
Drilling down on that a little bit, I think embedded in your answer is parts of this discussion that's been going on by you and others about the need for the United States to accept the North as a nuclear weapons state. And that leads to this distinction between arms control and disarmament. Give us a sense of why this acceptance is important. I mean, I think for most people, it's clear that North Korea has the bomb. So what is the real issue here?
Yeah, so I mean, just to be clear, so I don't actually advocate for formal acceptance. My colleague at Carnegie, Toby Dalton, and I chimed in on this debate. We wrote an article a few weeks ago in which we basically made the point that the whole acceptance debate that's playing out is a little bit of a red herring in the sense that it doesn't actually matter when the bottom line is concerned, right? So the acceptance debate hinges around legitimacy, right? So I think you're absolutely right in what you just said, which is that we all know North Korea has the bomb. We all know we're in a nuclear deterrence relationship with North Korea in the sense that they hold our homeland at risk. And so in a serious crisis, the president of the United States will be deterred from recklessly attacking North Korea because the president's military and intelligence advisors will tell him or her that the North Koreans have ICBMs that potentially can strike the U.S. homeland if we fail at, let's say, preempting, which I think we would. I think the North Koreans have a sufficiently large and survivable force today that I would not feel good about advising that the president seek to preempt in a crisis, because we would probably not be able to get all their warheads and they would be able to release nuclear weapons against targets that we would rather not have nuclear weapons targeted at. That is a separate issue from what de jure acceptance might look like, right? So use the term nuclear weapon state, which for me traditionally means, in the NPT context. That is a status that North Korea will never have, right? So that is, I think, moot off the bat. The other thing is, the United States, should the president of the United States make some kind of declaration or statement that, I, Joe Biden, hereby give North Korea a gold star and declare them a nuclear weapons power. I mean, I don't think we should. I don't think there's any value in that. What I think we should do is really, base policy around the obvious premise that is in front of us, which is that we are already, insofar as military and intelligence planning is concerned, treating North Korea as a nuclear-armed adversary. But while we do that, our policy still continues to be this sort of compellent goal that we have of denuclearization, which fundamentally, again, is concerned with the possession of nuclear weapons by North Korea. And this actually creates what I think is a fundamental incompatibility between what we are trying to do, which is deter nuclear use by North Korea, reduce the risk from North Korea in crises, while sort of pursuing this broader compelling objective. So acceptance itself, I don't really think matters all that much. What really does matter is the way in which we practically move forward, right? So Toby and I in that article, we even make the point that a lot of what we traditionally talked about as denuclearization steps, right? Shutting down the 5 megawatt gas graphite reactor at Yongbyon, for instance, getting the North Koreans to agree to a freeze on missile testing. These are risk reduction steps, right? They do move us towards denuclearization, but they also reduce the risk to the United States, to our allies. They reduce the rate at which North Korea is reprocessing and reprocessing spent fuel rods, producing plutonium, building new warheads, improving the quality of their missiles. All of this stuff is risk reduction. And so the acceptance debate, I think, kind of takes our eyes off the ball a little bit. And so we sort of think that the United States should really begin from the premise that we already do inherently accept, which is that the North Koreans have nuclear weapons. Even in the context of the alliance with South Korea, we are rewriting our operational war plans right now because we acknowledge that North Korea's capabilities have changed. So when the facts change, our military plans change, and our policy should change. And that second part, I think, is what needs to happen.
So in your view, this is really about what are the tactical steps of negotiating with the North, right? Are your goals complete disarmament of the North, or can we take an approach where we're really going at risk reduction and arms control?
I think that's basically right. The Biden administration keeps saying in public that we have no preconditions when it comes to meeting with the North Koreans. And I think that's a good thing to say in public, except I don't think we actually mean that. Because I think we do have a big precondition, which is that any meeting we have with the North Koreans now, it could be anywhere in the world, could be any time. That's what we've said. We'll meet you anywhere, anytime. But the conversation has to be about denuclearization. And that, I think, is a mistake. Because if we do really mean that there are no preconditions, and if Kim Jong Un picks up the phone, which I don't think he's going to do realistically, but let's say he picks up the phone and he says, I will meet with you in Helsinki or Stockholm or wherever to have an open-ended conversation about nuclear risk reduction. I think we should pick up the phone and I think we should go to that meeting, right? Implicitly, what we've heard from certain Biden administration officials is that we would not take that meeting because our goal continues to be denuclearization. And look, allies are part of the picture here. I'm not saying that the United States should unilaterally take this step without consulting our allies or bringing them on board. Japan and South Korea are very adamant that we do not abandon the objective of denuclearization. And there's a whole separate debate about the proliferation consequences of moving away from denuclearization, because implicitly, even though I don't think it's true, implicitly that will signal to Seoul and Tokyo that we have accepted a nuclear North Korea, which is, again, I think why the acceptance debate actually does more harm than it helps, which is that it isn't accepting North Korea to actually move towards risk reduction. It's acknowledging that even if a country has an illegitimate nuclear arsenal, we should still move towards measures that can reduce the risk of war.
So last question. As you look ahead, we're in 2023, of course, what would you like to see happen on the peninsula?
Sure. So, I mean, I would love, of course, for Kim Jong Un to stop testing all the things that he's testing, but I know better than to think that that's going to happen. So what I really think needs to happen is some of the pressure that's been building in the inter-Korean context between the two Koreas as a result of this spiral that's now been ongoing for 4.5 months, give or take. I think we need to find a way to sort of let some of that steam out. And there's a lot here, I think, that could throw a wrench into that. The U.S. and South Korea are going to carry out large-scale exercises in March. It's the 70th anniversary of the alliance being founded, and so it is going to be a prominent year for the U.S. and ROK. You have greater demands for reassurance from South Korea. You briefly mentioned the interview that the South Korean president gave right after the new year, where he made reference to joint nuclear planning, which I think certainly raised some eyebrows in Washington, where there are no such plans underway. I just want to be clear about that. But all of this, I think, suggests that we need to find a way to de-escalate tensions. And in my opinion, the way to de-escalate this is going to really fall to the United States and South Korea. The North Koreans are not going to make the move. The reason I think South Korea and the United States should make a change in the way they talk about their exercises and the way in which South Korea communicates its intentions to North Korea, I think just turning down the volume would help a lot, right? So not being as public about the activities that the alliance is undertaking to sustain deterrence, which I think is important. I'm not an advocate for completely turning off the military readiness and exercise, because conventional deterrence is what will matter ultimately if a serious crisis breaks out. That, I think, is going to be really important, and I would really like to see that happen. If it doesn't happen, this might unfortunately be the more realistic scenario for this year. We will continue to run risks that the two Koreas will find themselves inadvertently, through misperception, miscalculation, potentially heading into a serious crisis. Right? This drone incident at the end of last year, I think, really concerns me. Right? The North Koreans fly 5 drones across the MDL. The South Koreans fortunately followed standard operating procedures, but that could very easily have been seen as the start of a potential armed attack on a South Korean facility. These types of attacks happen, right? In 2019, 2 Saudi oil fields were attacked by drones that appeared to originate in Iran, for instance. And so these types of events, I think, really give me pause and concern. So that's my biggest recommendation. I think finding a way to let the steam out of the ongoing spiral, that's going to be absolutely essential.
Ankit, thank you so much for your time and best of luck in all your work.
Thanks a lot, Tom. This was a fun discussion.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.